Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a nice evening. I'm Rigo Melgar, and I'm very happy to be hosting this Limits to Growth 50 Years Later panel with Charlie Hall, Josh Farley, Nay Hagens, and Marta Ceroni. We are very happy to be doing it in memory of Donna Meadows, who I'm sure has influenced many of us. And this panel is being co-sponsored by the Leadership of the Ecozoic, which is an international program between McGill University and the University of Vermont, and the Academy for Systems Change, the Gunn Institute for Environment, and Rethinking Economics, UVM. So just, you know, this was the Limits to Growth team. Jorgen Randers, Jay Forrester, Donna Meadows, Dennis Meadows, and William, back in the early 1970s. And this is what we're talking about today. And yeah, okay. And yeah, like I mentioned, this is in memory of the one-of-a-kind Donna Meadows, who got her PhD in biophysics from Harvard in 1968. And she lives through her work, right? And we're very grateful that she was here with us. She's here with us in one way or another. And I'm gonna appreciate very much having Charlie Hall here to present on the Limits to Growth 50 years later.
Okay, Limits to Growth was a remarkable book. It sold many millions, was translated to, I think, about 40 languages. And we were talking about it a whole lot back in the 1970s and 1980s. And the basic message of the Limits to Growth was that the pattern of economic growth and population growth that the world had been on for the last decades, even 2 centuries, could not possibly be continued. And the way they did this was with what was essentially the first global level computer model. There's all kinds of global level computer models now, but what they had was the first time they looked at about 7 main parameters. You can see them here. And this is over time. You see 1900 over in the one corner and 2100 over another. So it's 200 years. And this will turn out important. You see, they don't have anything in between those 2 years. And they have resources declining, the birth rate declining, the death rate declining, and this being about when they were doing the model, somewhere in the middle. And so this was data, I guess about 70% of the way over. They had data for, and then they made extensions into the future. They had industrial output per capita increase and then decline as resources became limiting. The population would get, food per capita would increase, and the number of people would increase, but so would the amount of pollution, and the pollution and less food per capita would kill people, and eventually the population would decline. In other words, good Lord, we can't continue what we're doing, and it will be catastrophic if we do so. And the only way, they tried many different ways to try to get a stable environment and where the population wouldn't crash. And the only way they could do that, they had to do 2 things in this model. They had to stabilize population, and they had to reduce new investment. You can continue to replace what you had as stuff wore out, but you could not have increased investment. And this is, of course, strikes at the heart of capitalism, which is all about investment and making more and continue growing and so forth and so on. And this limits to growth was argued over, both positive and negative. It was highly criticized, especially by economists. They did not like a biophysical basis. Now you have to realize that economics is basically a social science. It's based on not natural resources so much as what people want and what they're willing to give up in the market of one sort of thing to get another sort of thing. And there's no limits in conventional economics. It just doesn't exist. Certainly no material limits. In fact, no material stuff doesn't exist there at all except as prices. And when the predicted dramatic changes that the model predicted did not come to pass, they loudly proclaimed the model to be a failure. But the critics did not understand the timing. Remember, I showed you on the bottom line on the x-axis that there weren't tick marks, so you couldn't see where you were. And so the model not working well, we'll get to that in just a minute. Now, this is a cartoon of basically how I believe, well, I know the economy works. We take natural resources of all kinds, not just necessarily plants and animals, but copper in the ground and oil in the ground and all kinds of stuff, including, of course, the wildlife, and turn it into this giant industrial machine and generate wealth. And actually, after 50 years, the model is practically right on the money. And in fact, if you run it out for a few more years, it's still right on the money. Resources are certainly declining. We've used up about half our oil. The pollution is increasing. The model has been anything like that good over 50 years, even over 10 years. So those who criticize the limits to growth model don't understand the model is pretty much right on the money. My specialty is energy, and I have a new paper that's in review right now. And my estimate is that we're really about at peak oil. Now, if you want to include natural gas liquids and junky stuff, tar sands and stuff, we might have a little bit more oil. Gas hasn't peaked yet. Coal may or may not have peaked already. Does look like the oil has actually peaked, even including the crummy kinds of oil. We are to have a truly sustainable society. There's all kinds of stuff out there about sustainability. Almost none of that deals with the energy cost of whatever they're talking about. We have to deal with at least 7 things. First, of course, is climate change, and let's call it planetary boundaries, destruction of ecosystems, destruction of nature. And of course, we're paying a lot of attention to that. We're paying almost no attention to depletion of fossil fuels, which I think is at least as important, probably more so. And that includes the declining energy return on investment of our most important fuels. A fourth thing that we have to think about is what's called Jevons paradox, that when you make, almost always people try to make things better by making them more efficient. But if you make something more efficient, you're going to make them cheaper. And if things are cheaper, as Stanley Jevons figured out with coal in 1850s, you're going to come up with Jevons paradox. It's a rebound effect that if you make things more efficient, you're going to make them cheaper and people use them more. We got to deal with that. We have to deal with growth theory and neoclassical economics. I think we simply cannot continue to grow either in population or in our total impact. And almost everybody tries to make us more efficient without trying to worry about growth. There is an enormous physical difficulty of shifting to renewables. The energy return on investment, as I indicated, is likely to decline seriously. And the most difficult and most important is the social response to decreasing energy for consumption. If we're going to change into a green or a renewable energy future, it's going to take an enormous energy investment, and that will have to come out of investment, and people won't like that. Again, here's this question, this modeled estimate from Kaplan Perez of declining energy return on investment if we go to 50, 75, or 100% renewable fuels. Now, is this computer model perfect? Of course not. No, none of these computer models are perfect. But we better, if you don't think it's right, you better figure out why it's not right. Because I think it's basically right. So here we are. We're in the situation of energy availability. This is a graph of energy availability. And all of our economic theories were developed when we were growing in terms of energy, growing in terms of our economy, growing in terms of population. Our energy supply is very likely to decrease in the future. This is fossil fuel. I don't know whether renewables are going to have some trajectory out here, but we're dealing with a future of much less availability of fossil fuels. And what economic theories are appropriate here? Well, they're certainly not the ones you learn in Econ 201 or anywhere in economics. And we have to think about that. And I'm going to end with a quote from Donna Meadows, who I knew reasonably well and admired enormously. And she says, if you define the goal of a society as GDP, that society will do its best to produce GDP or GNP. It will not produce welfare, equity, justice, or efficiency unless you define a goal and regularly measure and report the state of welfare, equity, justice, or efficiency. This applies all over the place with energy, with healthcare. There's just a wonderful article not long ago in the New Yorker about how Costa Rica, with much less use of resources, produces people that live longer, much higher health statistics over their whole life, because the function of the health system is to deliver health, not make profits. And that is, well, what we got to do if you are going to survive. I'm going to be gone. I'm 78. So, it's enough oil to get me to the end of my life, but not enough to get you to the end of your life, Rigo and all your peers. So my final professional goal is to push this crazy bunch of fairy tales called neoclassical economics off this cliff and get on with biophysical economics, get on with economics that's based in reality. And I know that my former student Rigo knows an awful lot about this and can be your great teacher. Goodbye to everybody.
Thank you so much, Charlie. We appreciate your participation in this panel. Take care.
Yeah, so I have challenges giving brief presentations. So I'm going to focus on one very narrow topic, which is, which is whether we are pursuing the right goals, essentially. So I really want to look at how we measure growth in the forms of GDP and what the costs are of growth and the benefits and what the future entails. And I should begin by saying that I'm 59 years old, so per capita consumption has tripled since I was born. Since Donna Meadows wrote her report, per capita consumption has increased 240%, and human populations have doubled. The 240% increase is the US alone. Globally, it's been more. So, the economy is more than 5 times larger than when Donna Meadows wrote this. And I think, and the first I want to talk about, what have we lost? So this is, first of all, I'm going to look at some correlations here. Correlations are certainly not causation, but the economy is a physical system. You can't make something from nothing. You need to use raw materials that come from nature. You use energy to transform them into economic products. Most of the energy we use is fossil fuels. And those raw materials are the structural building blocks of our ecosystems. So one would think in this type of world that with exponentially increasing economic growth, we're transforming more and more ecosystem structure into economic products and waste, degrading the ecosystems, losing the life support functions we depend on for our survival. So what we'd exactly expect to see is a very strong correlation between GDP and the number of threatened and endangered species, which this is an article from Science shows, and another article showing just in a different way, but economic growth is the solid line, and threatened and endangered species overall is the boxes, and the circles are the marine species. So it's very clear we are threatening biodiversity to the point where humans and their livestock now account for the vast majority of terrestrial biomass, and humans and their mammalian livestock count for 96% of terrestrial mammalian biomass. Humans alone outweigh all other mammals tenfold. And if we believe that we depend on a well-functioning ecosystem for our survival, that's a terrifying statistic. What else have we lost? So there's all this talk about dematerialization and how we can possibly learn to produce more economic output with less CO2 as we get better technologies. Very, very little evidence of that occurring. But what is very clear is the larger a GDP a country has, the more greenhouse gas emissions. This is extremely clearly shown here on this log graph, that more GDP per capita means more climate change per capita, with devastating threats to from this. And you'll always hear from the economists, oh yes, we have had negative impacts on the ecosystems, but life expectancy has been skyrocketing. So since 1972, when Donna Meadows wrote this, life expectancy in the US has increased by more than 10%. So we're at almost 79 years now, but the life expectancy in Cuba and Costa Rica is higher. Cuba has 1/6 our per capita income, Costa Rica 1/5, meaning there's no correlation between life expectancy and economic growth. So it's hard to make a claim there. How about health? So what I look at is, in natural systems, there is a normal time of growth. And for us, we grow until we're in our late teens, and that's normal. If we pursue growth beyond our late teens, we're just getting bigger and fatter. And you can look at this, pursuing growth beyond the right domain. We in 1972, less than 1% of the US population had diabetes. It's over 10% today. And in my view, that's a result of pursuing growth past the point where we should. How about people living in poverty? That's the other thing. We need to grow because so many people are in dire poverty. 1972, 25 million Americans lived in poverty. 2021, 37 million Americans lived in poverty. So we've done a pretty poor job, and it is a lower percentage, but it's way more absolute people. We've done a pretty terrible job with that. But maybe though, with all this growth, we definitely have bigger flat screen TVs, bigger bigger cars, bigger houses. So maybe we're just much happier, but there's just no evidence of that either. General happiness in the US seems to be in decline. I would argue much of that in stress over the numerous crises we face. So there's their measure of growth. This is what we always use. It was never meant to measure welfare, but it was meant to be a measure of growth, and economists claim it's a proxy for welfare. So first, I want to ask what GDP tells us about the average person. So if we took the average height of everybody in this audience and added the tallest person in the world, it would barely change the average height. The average is a useful statistic. So per capita height is a useful statistic. However, if we took the average income of everybody in this room, or in this event, and added the richest person in the world, none of your incomes would matter. The average would be absolutely meaningless. And this is because height follows a normal distribution. Shown here is this black curve, and income follows a power law distribution. which means most of the wealth is in the far tail ends. So this is an actual, this is a typical power law distribution on your right. And on your left is the actual distribution of income in the US, except for these last two tiers. If we wanted to actually include people like Elon Musk and Bill Gates on this, I would have to extend my graph literally by many miles to include them. So the basic point, though, is that GDP tells us absolutely nothing about the well-being of the average person, in which case, why would we even care what GDP is? Why would we pursue it as a goal? But it gets much worse than that. And I want to look at some of the insights, what GDP has to say about, or what GDP actually does measure, and some insights from Ukraine. So first of all, on the left, I'm just showing natural gas production over the past 25 years. And you just see it goes up. Okay, big deal. What's that mean? So we count natural gas production towards our GDP. This is an extraction of a stock of inherited wealth, and saying that, we've learned to get it out much faster, but that is no more an increase in our income than if you had inherited a trust fund and got an ATM card that let you withdraw twice as much. That would not be increasing your wealth. That would be actually depleting your wealth. So that's one take-home message, is that GDP systematically measures, so GDP measures depletion of our natural assets is a gain. On the right-hand side, what you see is these rapidly soaring prices of natural gas just since the start of 2022 as a result of the Ukraine invasion. And what I want to call attention to here, the price of natural gas has doubled, and in response to a very small decrease in supply. And this is characteristic of essential resources, is that the less you produce, the more revenue they generate, the more they contribute to GDP. So we're using as a measure of welfare something that the less of the essential resources we produce, the greater their share in that measure of welfare, which is actually perfectly perverse. I mean, you couldn't imagine a stupider measure. What I also forgot to mention here too is about Ukraine. Now all these countries are investing much more in military expenditures, which also enhances GDP. And again, produces no benefits to anybody. It's just a pure cost. Here's the other wheat prices from the big jump in wheat prices. You can see at the very tail end here, skyrocketed. They were steadily trending up since 2019. So they've almost tripled over the past 5 years. But again, this is the same phenomena. A small decrease in the quantity of food leads to dramatic increase in prices. Tiny decreases in the supply of food in 2007, 2008, 2011, 2012 led prices of grains to double and triple. The less we produce of an essential resource, the more it contributes to our GDP. We should be applauding. How do we maximize GDP? So we have this food. How do we get the most contribution to GDP from that? This is a headline from the New York Times that makes the point I want to make, even though the article itself didn't. Why 20 million people are on the brink of famine in a world of plenty. The picture on the left is from the famine in Bangladesh I forget the years, but Marta writes about this. And the problem was not too little food being produced. The problem was people did not have enough money to buy it. Bangladesh was exporting food at the same time its citizens were suffering from famine. Why is that? Because markets allocate resources to those who will pay the most. We'll allocate the marginal loaf of bread or bowl of rice to the person paying the most, which happens to be the overfed and wealthy West. And so markets are essentially systematically allocating resources to those who who need them least, who gain the least benefit. And we really have to recognize this. So in the United States, we spend 20% of our GDP on healthcare. If our goal is to maximize GDP and therefore maximize our expenditures, we have the best healthcare system in the world, bar none. But if you actually think the purpose of a healthcare system is to provide, life expectancy, low infant mortality, low maternal mortality, healthy quality of life, then we have the worst healthcare system among the developed nations. And the point is that in many, many ways, and I could go on with a litany of problems with GDP, where if you think of it as a measure of welfare, it's really poorly designed. If, on the other hand, you think of it as a measure of cost, it's extremely effective. It tells us how fast we are depleting the planet's resources, how much pollution we are pumping out. And it really is a very effective measure of cost. And if you think it's a good idea to try to maximize GDP, then I guess the United States does have the best healthcare system and we should just stick with it. But many Americans would beg to differ. I'm going to use my last few minutes to talk about debt and inflation, because what I showed before is these rising fossil fuel prices, these rising food prices. And what people don't realize is, where does money come from? So almost all money, well over 90%, is loaned into existence by banks. When you go to a bank to borrow money, you're not borrowing money somebody else deposited. The bank is issuing you new money, and in the bank's ledgers, the money they give to you is a liability, but the IOU they get from you, your mortgage, is an asset, and assets and liabilities balance, so the bank's sheets balance, but money is issued as interest-bearing debt. This figure shows the the growth of interest-bearing debt. I meant to truncate it at 72. I forgot to do that. But we see the interest-bearing debt has now risen to 370% of GDP. It's a larger sum and growing faster than GDP. And that debt, money, is a claim on real resources. It's a claim on, and it's an exponentially growing claim on real resources, but the quantity of resources we actually have is in decline. We have overshot carrying capacity. We're depleting our natural asset base, and we actually have way too much money chasing far too few goods and services, which inevitably results in inflation. And everybody is saying, oh, inflation, it's absolutely terrible. You know, the politicians and the economists were applauding when we had inflation in the stock market. We saw a 30% increase in stock prices last year alone, and the stock market is now twice the value of GDP. So we saw a transfer of like 50% of GDP to the richest people in our country, the 1% that owns half. So if we do get inflation, people say, well, inflation's not that bad as long as as long as wages keep pace with inflation. But the fact is that inflation not only reduces the purchasing power of our money, it decreases the value of debt. Right now, the financial sector siphons off enormous amounts of wealth from debtors. So debtors pay interest to the financial sector systematically. Inflation decreases the value of debt. If we had 7 years of 10% inflation, the value of debt would fall by 50%. If we had 21 years of 10% inflation, we'd essentially have a jubilee. So I believe it's impossible not to have deflation because we have too much money chasing too few goods and services, and that carefully managed inflation could be an enormous boon, transferring wealth from creditors to debtors and reducing our demand on global ecosystems. And that's my 15 allotted minutes. So I'd be happy to have questions afterwards. So I hope it wasn't too much, but I'll stop sharing, and then hopefully we have. Don't know who we'll turn to next, but
thank you so much, Josh. Now we're gonna go to Nate, who is the director of the Energy and Our Future organization. Thank you so much, Nate.
Happy Earth Day, everyone. Can you see my screen?
yes.
Yes. So last night I did a Earth Day presentation, and I'm going to adapt what I did for this brief 15-minute. I don't want to cut into Marta's time. One thing that Donna Meadows famously said is that models, black box models, give out answers. And systems dynamics professionals didn't like that. They liked models that were able to change how we view the world. And if you change how you understand how the system fits together, you actually don't need computers and math. You can figure things out. So in that spirit, I'm going to offer a bird's eye view of our situation on how things fit together. This is my mental model: energy, materials, information or technology, money, as Josh said, and human behavior, the environment, how the system fits together, and the implications for the future. And I won't have time to do the 80 cards that I did last night. I'm just going to do a selection of them that are relevant to this conversation. There is a biophysical trinity that is an absolute truth in our global economy, that we combine technology with energy and materials in every single thing that we do. The correlation between material and GDP is 1 for 1. If we grow our economy at 3%, we're going to grow our material use by 3%. The correlation between energy and GDP is around 99%. Over time, we get between 0.5% and 1% efficient. But these things grow in tandem and have at a global level. We now use 100 billion barrel of oil equivalents of coal, oil, and natural gas, that the labor equivalent of that is 500 billion human worker equivalents that we're adding to the 5 billion real humans. And since our culture is energy blind and our economists just look at the cost of extraction, not the benefits, we ignore the benefits of these fossil armies. This results in cheaper goods, higher profits, higher wages, and more people, and has completely supported our economy to the tune, as Josh mentioned, it's 5 times bigger than when Donna Meadows wrote the book. Our economy is 1,000 times bigger than it was 500 years ago, measured by population times consumption. One thing I'm going to spend a little bit of time on, Josh mentioned depletion. These things we are extracting these low entropy, non-renewable resources 10 million times faster than they were sequestered. We use technology that acts as a larger straw. And the straw, we get enough milkshake in our mouth and we're happy, but the wider straw, which is fracking technology and other technology, gets us that much closer to the slurping sound. And if you look at these 2 graphs of US oil production, they're the same graphs that we peaked in 1970, and then technology overcame the problems and we had a big spike from 2008 onwards. The graph on the right is the same exact graph, but broken out by province, the green showing lower 48 conventional oil, the orange showing the North Slope and Alaska, the blue showing oil that was in the contiguous United States off the continental shelf under the ocean. And now we're accessing the source rock, the tight oil that depletes at 80 to 90% in a year. This is the source rock. There's nothing left after that. If you look at depletion profiles, the orange sliver here shows all wells in existence that were drilled 2011 or before. The gray is 2012, et cetera, all the way until the red is the new wells that were drilled in 2020 and their decline profile. What this means is that if we were to stop drilling today, and the US produces 12 million barrels a day, we consume 20 million barrels a day. If we were to stop drilling, we would decline 39% in our production in the first year, another 39% in the second year. We have to keep drilling just to keep production constant. And even that will not be possible for much longer. Here, commensurate with the peak in oil extraction, and as the limits to growth forecast, we are kind of nearing the end of growth. For most of human history, growth was non-existent or incredibly small. In the 17th century, we started to uptick to 0.3% a year. Then we came across fossil carbon and we boosted growth dramatically. Now, from today, if we were to grow at 2.5% to 3%, which is what most institutions and governments expect, we will double the energy and materials that we use today in the next 25 years or 30 years. And we will double it again in the next 30 years. So if you're a 20-year-old listening to this, by the time you're 80, we will be 4x the energy and materials that we are today. Lots of ecologists have put together the facts about all this: overshoot, carrying capacity, population ecology. Rachel Carson and many after her warned about the biophysical and ecological underpinnings of our situation. But relative to economists and businessmen, ecologists were kind of like the tortoise and the hare. And so we lost out to stories that our newfound wealth was due to human cleverness and not due to depletion of natural resources. So the shaman of our culture are also energy blind and ecology blind. What we have ahead of us is a chasm, which is we have a 19 terawatt economy, and this is absolutely unsustainable, not even including the ecological aspects, but just the financial and biophysical inputs. Something like 10 terawatts is more sustainable, where we use our low carbon, our remaining low entropy carbon fuels as seed corn for something else. But there's no plan for do that. All the plans are to grow. And so the disconnect is how far will we decline before we develop something that is somewhat sustainable. And an Agrigore is a non-physical entity that is created by the behavior of multiple beings. This represents the superorganism, which is a physical manifestation of human beings self-organizing as individuals, as small businesses, as corporations, and as nation states to maximize monetary profits tethered to energy, tethered to carbon. So what does this mean going ahead? We have a date with a musical chairs situation where our financial representations of reality are going to finally recalibrate with our lower biophysical inputs. How much of a drop does this imply, and who gets injured by the drop are two very relevant questions for ecological economics. I don't know the future. No one does. I think there's things that I am confident will not happen, like continued economic growth for much longer. But the concept of emergence comes into play here. You cannot predict what will happen by looking at the behavior of the individual parts. A lot of what is coming is unknown. My work suggests we are headed for a great simplification, which is akin to the 1930s, the US, where it starts by financial recalibration, and it will change everything because of the energy profiles going forward in time. So I have a very long list of what to do, but I don't want to borrow any of Marta's time, so I'm just going to give a few headline ideas here. Our political bodies are not ready for the things that we're going to have to do in the next 10 years because a lot of the draconian measures are both socially and politically unacceptable, will get you kicked out of office. So one thing we have to do is educate our leaders and create constituency blueprints, break glass plans, so that as these events unfold in coming years, there are people that understand what's going on and have plans. I think Germany would have preferred to have these plans set in place because of what's happening in Ukraine right now. There was an article yesterday that people are advised in Germany to shower only every 3 weeks. And in the meantime, just wash up 4 parts of their body. You can guess which 4 parts. The German food is up 30 to 50% in the last few weeks. So they are facing an energy reality because of what's happening in Ukraine. We're going to need new models of governance. Is democracy the fitting solution for the challenges that we face in the late stages of overshoot? I don't know the answer to this, but just like we need advanced policy on biophysical interventions, we're going to need new ways of governing both globally, nationally, and locally. That will incentivize both conservation and innovation more aligned with an ecological economics reality. Our education systems are completely unprepared and are not preparing our young people for the world that's coming. We need new models of education that both help the planet, our societies, and our citizens. We need different sorts of innovation because we are a problem-solving species, and we will always innovate. But right now, innovation ends up building efficiency. It's in service of the Agrigore or the global heat engine. And so if we are able to jettison GDP as a cultural goal and get something more aligned to well-being, like Josh said, then efficiency and technology will play a huge role. But what are the types of inventions that will help us going forward? Could you imagine a 100-year solar panel or a 200-year solar panel or things like that? We don't know, but I think right now we're inventing too many gadgets that end up being energy sinks. Lastly, we are the first generation of our species to be able to understand where we came from, how we got here, what we're doing, what we need, what is possible. And in addition to the cleverness that brought us here, maybe we can open both eyes and incorporate wisdom on the path ahead. Marta, I'm going to, oh, no, I have 2 more slides. I'm sorry. 2 nights ago, I gave a presentation with Donna Meadows in Rochester, Minnesota. This was a slide he used, and it's going to be in a documentary, so I'm sure he wouldn't mind if I showed it. But in 1972, they had 2 options, either a growth and steady state, and that's shown in the blue line, or continue to grow and overshoot and then collapse, which is the red line. Well, 50 years later, this is Dennis drawing on the right, we followed the growth at all cost path, and now we have 2 options. We have to figure out how to get back down, how to descend and hold things together, which is crossing my little hand bridge on the chasm drawing, or there is a systemic collapse. So closing with a quote from Donella, remember always that everything you know and everything everyone knows is only a model. Get your model out there where it can be viewed, invite others to challenge your assumptions and add their own. Thank you and happy Earth Day.
Thank you so much, Nate. That was a great presentation. Now, I'm very happy to have Marta Ceroni. I like when I get to practice my ecology Italian sometimes. Thank you so much, Marta.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the folks who are here, because we have a double audience, which is always fun in these double times. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully that we don't hit some snags again, but let's see if that's gonna be fine. All right. Well, so I'm here from a little bit of a parallel world, if I should say. I mean, I definitely, I'm in the world of reality. Right. So I was just saying that I come a little bit from a parallel world. I get the same data, of course, and the same understanding of what's happening in reality to our Mother Earth. And so I get a lot of emotions about this after these presentations, of course. And when I say that I come from a little parallel world, is a place where in the work I do, we look into the human heart and what makes people care and how people interact and how people go deeper into their own beliefs and motivations for why things happen, why ultimately our behaviors amount to what we have been seeing, you know, from the presentations before. These graphs are terrifying. These graphs have something to do also with time. And so I wanted to actually take a moment. Let's see. I'll explain what we do at my organization. I'm going to skip this slide. But to be honest, I would like to take 50 seconds of stillness, 1 second per year of limits to growth. There's something deeply profound and staggering about these decades that have gone by. Decades since we have had the early warnings that limits to growth produced, and also the promises, because we just have to be mindful that limits to growth contained both a big set of warnings and also a beautiful promise that has been oftentimes forgotten. And so just to honor these 50 years that have gone by, you know, whether you were born in 72 or before or after, we have been on a path for really changing things, and it's been tough. You know, if you've been in the field for some time, and some of us have been, you know, it's not an easy life to swim in this data all the time. So I can see that it takes a toll on us, to be honest. And so I just want to invite, getting a little emotional here. Just take 50 seconds, 1 second per year, to really feel it. Feel what it has been to be in this journey together and with some of our people who have led the journey. And I would like to feel it in the body. So if you can close your eyes for a moment, or focus on the picture, which is an image of stillness. Really feel what kind of emotions are coming up for you after the talks, but also after all this time. And I just would like to invite gratitude for how you've been showing up for this work and for caring. And gratitude for the people who have come before us, who have led the way, who had shared the warnings and the promises. And we hold still the promises. I'm grateful to be here. And grateful for each of you showing up here. And yes, we have work to do, and we have each other. So, as we breathe in some air, you know, I've been wondering about this question a lot. You know, Donna Meadows, as a team member, you know, she's been swimming. She had been swimming for decades in this reality, in the truth. She had provided tools for really looking through the lens of systems thinking and systems modeling, looking at current reality with some wisdom, and then bringing us to the verge of making choices. And that's been all about her life is that ability of really consciously looking into the options that are available to us with joy, because she was acting from a place of vision. But to me, one question that has been essential is, so, you know, you swim for decades in the world of simulation modeling where the world collapses, you know, you see that in 1972. What do you do with that? What do you do with that knowledge? You know, what do you do with that difficult knowledge? How do you shape your life? And so I have had the privilege to read a lot of Donna Meadows' work. I was working, and I'm still working at the Sustainability Institute, that it was founded in 1996 by Donna Meadows, which has gone by different names, and the current name is Academy for Systems Change, which reflects a certain type of work that I'll talk more about later. So going back to the question, if you have, you know, been a modeler and you have seen that future somehow coming, what do you do, and how do you orient your life? It would be wonderful to have a conversation around how do we orient our current lives. But before we do that, I just wanted to read this beautiful way that Donna Meadows would describe herself, how she would introduce herself if she were here. As an ex-biophysicist, an opinionated columnist, a perpetual fundraiser, a gardener, an opera lover, a baker, a farmer, a teacher, a go baguette fly, who lives on a sheep farm and writes on a Macintosh computer with a Buddha sitting on top of it, and a cat on her lap, and a dog at her feet. And by the way, I have a dog here with me at my feet, on my lap. So this is a beautiful way, the way she would introduce herself. And also, 1 second, I just wanted to go back to this picture, which I just found last week, as I said, that I was going through her papers at the Runner Library, and look for a moment at the type of environment, professional environment that she was in. So she would go to these international conferences, global conferences of global modelers at that time. So the World 3 model was the first one, but then just a few months later or a few years later, many more came up of different types of models in Mexico, in Russia, and different places to really start comparing notes about these global trends. And she would attend these conferences. In this case, she's at Dartmouth, but she would attend conferences where there would be 31 modelers, and there would be 2 women, or here 1 woman out of 25 participants. And so just how do you, that her main thing was going to be teaching, because she needed to teach in order to really support a new worldview coming forward. So as I looked at her life and her work, you could see, you know, if we were to distill some elements of her life and look at them as an inspiration, it could be distilled to 3 things. And I'm going to give an example of this. Use your voice for change. And the way Donna Meadows did that was that I was astonished that even before Limits to Growth was published, she would already use it to affect policy making. And so she would write policy briefings for the legislators in Massachusetts to really affect change. And it was the population tick bomb at the time was a big thing. And I'm sure there's been a discussion about population here in this particular institution a lot. These days, it doesn't seem to be that particular big leverage point, or this conversation on population has changed big time. But going back in time and looking at her papers, it was interesting. A lot of the advocacy was around policy indeed, and the choices ahead of us. So she would, every single nugget of work that she would do on modeling would be communicated at different levels. It could be communicated for her peers in the scientific community, and so that's one audience. The other audience would be popular magazines, policymakers. They would have their briefings, and the same type of work, the same nugget of work, the same article would also be shared with her friends. She had a curated, it would be like a blog these days, but it was actually a newsletter, and she would write paper letters. They were called the Dear Folks letters, which we have in our archive. And so for me, it was interesting to see how one findings, one set of studies would reach all these different audiences at the same time. The other piece, looking at her life, is really about living a so-called systemic life. She lived a very interconnected life. She, you know, as she progressed in finding her best way to be in this world, or the manifestation of what this world was going to be about for her, she, as you probably might remember, had a MacArthur Genius Award, and she used most of that money to actually start an intentional community not too far from here, which is in Heartland, Vermont, and which is still existing and still super successful and very vibrant with kids and intergenerational communities. And so she was living on the land, so connection to the land, connection with the animals and farming, the reality of farming, an intentional community, a research institute that she had founded, which was based there on the land. And she was teaching, so she was connected, and she really cared for younger people. So for her, in fact, she at some point gave up tenure, which, you know, I'm talking from an academic environment, it's always very hard to make decisions like that, you know. Do I go for tenure? Once I am in tenure, do I just live the life of a tenure professor? And she decided not to anymore, so that she would actually focus exclusively on teaching and writing and farming, because she had enough of the academic meetings happening all the time. And then lastly, she would hold a creative orientation, meaning that she would move in the world as if she was following a vision. So the vision for her was really the founding, the grounding way that she would come into the work. She operated from what Otto Scharmer would call the emerging future. She was already in that future, and just the fact of inhabiting that future was enabling actually the actualization of that future in the multiple environments that she influenced and infiltrated. Sometimes I say infiltrated because she was on so many different boards and ways of influencing things. And one last comment on this is that she lived a fractal life. When I say fractal, I just want to mention this concept that systems change happens at every little levels and as the big. And so the kind of change that we are bringing into the world happens in this room where I am right now. And it can happen in a meeting. It can happen at a meeting with the policymaker. It really is the same type of aspiration that is manifested in whatever we do. So she did exactly the same, whether she started a paper or started, a new plot on the farm or whatever it was, she would envision it. And so she would just show up in the same way for these different types of change. She had a very difficult relationship with the fact that people would not take truths easily. When she published Limits to Growth, as you know, the reactions were rejection at all levels, a level of denial that was toxic, in fact. And some of it was coming, which was the most painful thing for her, was coming from academia, was coming from colleagues of hers, even other modelers, for whom the biggest mistake of Donella and the rest of the team was how dare a scientist take a stance and try to make shifts in the real world. How dare scientists get dirty with real life and making change. And so that was very painful for her. She wrote about that. But to me, and so it was obvious that something that was pretty intuitive. I mean, the team of Limits to Growth thought it was a no-brainer, right? I mean, infinite growth on a finite planet, is not possible. That was their orientation. They just did the modeling to actually have some evidence, like that's the scientific method. But no, everybody else was actually living in a bubble of illusion of infinite growth. So that, everybody went back to like, okay, what do we do with that? Donna Meadows invested her life in getting clearer and clearer about this relationship between truth-telling and fact-telling, and visioning. And also she realized that, presenting data is not enough, which is by now we know because we lived through a pandemic, and you might remember the early phases of the pandemic, how much denial there was. And climate change also, of course, is inspiring denial as well. So we could argue, in fact, that when Limits to Growth was published, it was a very early, tepid experiment into what the human mind can actually process. What kind of truths can the human mind can actually process? And what are the qualities that are needed for the human being altogether beyond the mind to actually hold difficult truths and difficult realities, difference in general? And so that bridge between having a clear set of instruments for looking at truth, but also holding the vision, that to me really is an important tool for understanding Donna Meadows' work. And then she, later in life, in fact, one of the chapters in Beyond the Limits was all about the qualities necessary for the transition to sustainability, which were these 5, which I don't have much time to share all about. But it's essentially creating networks of deep collaboration, continuing to learn and having a learning stance, and loving. She in that environment, it was kind of a little bit asphyxiating. She was able to talk actually about love, and she got some dirt for that, academically.
Thank you so much, Marta. That was beautiful. And one last thing from my side was my quote that I also had a quote. I asked everyone to share a quote from Donna Meadows that had inspired them. And for me, this one is one of the greatest quotes that she ever had, is the scarce resource is not oil, metals, clean air, capital, labor, or technology. It is our willingness to listen to each other and learn from each other and to seek the truth rather than seek to be right. And I think that, I mean, it doesn't get better than that. So I guess I'm gonna stop sharing and I'm gonna ask a question. I'm gonna get you guys to discuss a little bit with me about all this, everything that we've been talking.